There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a neighborhood right before everything goes to hell, a quiet that feels heavy, like the air before a tornado touches down. And that was exactly the atmosphere hanging over my driveway the morning my life turned into a federal investigation. My name is Arthur Miller, just a guy who spent 30 years bending conduit and wiring circuit breakers as a master electrician, a man who wanted nothing more than to fade into the background of Oakwood Reserve, a painfully manicured subdivision just outside of San Antonio, where the grass is measured with rulers and the smiles are as fake as the siding on the houses. I moved here for Elena, my wife, because she loved the idea of community, loved the thought of block parties and safety. But Elena has been gone for 3 years now, taken by a sickness that moved faster than my grief ever could, leaving me with a 4-bedroom house that echoes when I walk and a restored 1972 Honda CT70 trail bike sitting in my driveway. Her last anniversary gift to me. A little piece of freedom she insisted I keep so I wouldn't rot away in a recliner. That bike wasn't just metal and rubber. It was the last time I saw her smile without pain, which is why, when I pulled up to my house after a run to the hardware store and saw Lexi Vance, the 19-year-old daughter of our HOA president, lazily hooking my bike to the back of a beat-up trailer, the red haze that flooded my vision was blinding. "What do you think you're doing?" I roared, slamming the door of my truck, the sound cracking like a gunshot across the pristine lawn. But Lexi just flipped her hair, looking at me with the bored indifference of a girl who has never heard the word no in her entire life. "Relax, old man," she scoffed, her boyfriend Tyler, a twitchy kid with tattoos creeping up his neck, continuing to ratchet the straps down on my property like he owned the place. "Mom said this is an eyesore. We're just helping you comply with the new aesthetic guidelines." That is grand theft. I stepped forward, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the effort it took not to physically intervene. "Unhook it now, or I'm calling the police." Lexi actually laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Go ahead, call them. Deputy Higgins is already on speed dial." And sure enough, 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up, but instead of justice, I got Deputy Higgins, a man who looked like he'd been bought and paid for years ago, stepping out of his cruiser with a weariness that suggested he really didn't want to do any paperwork. And then came the queen herself, Patty Vance, gliding out of her silver Lexus SUV like she was arriving at a gala, smelling of overpowering jasmine perfume and condescension, holding a manila folder like a weapon. "Officer, thank heavens," Patty said, ignoring me entirely, focusing her high-beam smile on the cop. "Mr. Miller here refuses to adhere to the revised Section 4 Paragraph 2 regarding recreational vehicle storage, which we voted on last week." She handed over a piece of paper, fresh ink, clearly typed up that morning, but Higgins didn't check the timestamp, didn't ask for proof of the vote. He just shrugged at me and said, "It's a civil matter, sir. If it's against HOA rules, they have the right to remove non-compliant vehicles from common view. You can pick it up from their storage facility once you pay the fine." I watched, helpless, as my connection to Elena, that vintage Honda, was dragged away down the street, Patty offering me a sad little pout that was dripping with venom, saying, "We just want what's best for property values, Arthur. Try to keep up." That night, I didn't sleep. I drove straight to the Behar County Clerk's office, fueled by rage and bad coffee. Because if there is one thing an electrician knows, it's that when there's a short in the system, you trace the wire back to the source. I spent hours in that dusty basement, scrolling through microfiche and digital records, and what I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because Patty's revised covenant wasn't filed. In fact, nothing had been legally filed for 2 years, meaning every fine she had levied was effectively extortion. But the real kicker, the thing that made my gut twist, was the vendor list. The landscaping company, Green Horizon, the pool maintenance crew, Aquapure, and the security firm, Vance Global Logistics. They were all funneling money into the same P.O. box in a strip mall, a box registered to Gordon Vance, Patty's husband, a man who claimed to be a high-flying pharmaceutical consultant always traveling to South America. I went home and did what any angry modern citizen does. I posted the video of the theft and a photo of the fake filing document to the neighborhood next door page with the caption, "Is Patty Vance rewriting the law, or just robbing us?" The reaction was instant, explosive, comments pouring in from neighbors like Maria Torres, a retired schoolteacher who had been fined for unauthorized rose bushes, and Stanley Kowalski, a quiet, hunched-over man who I knew was a retired forensic accountant, all of them sharing stories of Patty's tyranny. But Patty wasn't going to take a digital rebellion lying down. Within 48 hours, the Empire struck back with a vengeance that was almost impressive in its pettiness. I woke up to citations taped to my door like wallpaper, fines for excessive weed height when my lawn was a golf course, unauthorized auditory disturbances for running a table saw in my soundproof garage, and my personal favorite, improper refuse container placement because my trash can was 3 inches too far to the left. She was trying to bury me in paper, trying to drain my bank account with fees that totaled over $3,000 in a week, and she started parking that silver Lexus across from my house, watching me through dark sunglasses, a silent promise that she could take more than just my bike. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. She thought I was just a lonely widower who would roll over and die. She didn't realize that when you take a man's last memory of his wife, you strip away the only thing holding him back from total war. Maria Torres knocked on my back door late one Tuesday, looking over her shoulder like she was carrying nuclear codes, clutching a binder she'd managed to smuggle out when she briefly served on the board before resigning in disgust. "You need to see the bank statements, Arthur," she whispered, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette on my patio, the orange ember glowing in the twilight. "I quit because the math didn't add up. Gordon's company was billing us 10 grand a month for security consultation, but we don't have security guards. We have a gate that doesn't even work." I took the binder, the weight of it heavy in my hands, and as I turned the pages, seeing the transfers, the inflated costs, the sheer audacity of the theft, I realized this wasn't just a power-tripping suburban mom. This was a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association, and I was the only one stupid enough to poke the bear. The war room wasn't in the Pentagon or a police station. It was my dining room table, now covered in stacks of paper that smelled of old toner and desperation, illuminated by a flickering overhead light that I really needed to fix, but I was too busy staring at the anatomy of a crime. Stanley Kowalski had joined our little resistance cell, bringing with him a calculator that looked older than me and a mind that was sharp as a razor. He sat there, sipping herbal tea, his eyes darting across the spreadsheets Maria had provided, making little noises that terrified me more than any shout could. "This is sloppy," Stanley muttered, circling a line item in red ink. "Gordon Vance isn't just skimming off the top. Arthur, look at these deposits. Uniform amounts of $9,000 entering the HOA operating account from anonymous donors and then immediately being paid out to Vance Global Logistics for emergency infrastructure repair. Money laundering," I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "They're washing cash through the neighborhood." "Exactly." Stanley cleaned his thick glasses, looking grave, structuring deposits to avoid IRS flags. "But the volume, my God, Arthur, based on these projections, they've moved nearly $4 million through Oakwood Reserve in the last 3 years. You don't generate that kind of cash selling fake fines. This is external money coming in to get cleaned." The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't dealing with a greedy couple stealing from the reserve fund. We were dealing with people who needed to clean millions, which meant the source of that money was dark, likely dangerous, and definitely illegal. As if on cue, the intimidation tactics escalated from paper fines to physical threats. I came home the next day to find the word "rat" spray painted in jagged crimson letters across my garage door, the paint still wet and dripping like fresh blood onto the concrete. My security cameras, which I had upgraded to 4K resolution the day after the bike theft, caught Lexi doing it, giggling as she shook the can. But when I called Deputy Higgins, he watched the footage, looked at the paint, and said, "Hard to tell who that is with the hoodie. Could be anyone. Maybe you should stop provoking people, Mr. Miller." That was the moment I knew local law enforcement was useless, either incompetent or on the payroll. So I stopped calling them and started preparing for a siege, reinforcing my doors, installing motion sensors that flooded the yard with blinding light if a squirrel so much as sneezed. Then, the break we needed came from the most unlikely source: stupidity. Tyler, Lexi's boyfriend, got pulled over 3 counties away for doing 90 in a 35, and because he was not a smart man, he had the trunk of his car filled not with groceries, but with vacuum-sealed bags of synthetic opioids and enough cash to buy a small island. I heard about it because Maria's nephew was a clerk at the courthouse, and he tipped us off that Tyler was singing like a canary to cut a deal, mentioning a supply chain that ran through a nice suburban couple in Oakwood Reserve. That night, I didn't call the police. I called the FBI field office in San Antonio, and I didn't get a receptionist. I got transferred to Special Agent O'Malley, a woman whose voice sounded like she ate gravel for breakfast and had zero patience for nonsense. I met her at a diner 3 towns over, sliding Stanley's forensic accounting across the sticky table along with the flash drive of Lexi stealing my bike and vandalizing my home. Agent O'Malley flipped through the pages, her eyes widening slightly, the only emotion she showed, before she looked up at me over her black coffee. "You have no idea what you've stepped into, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Gordon Vance has been on our radar for moving product for a cartel out of Laredo, but we couldn't find the money. We couldn't figure out how he was washing it so clean, until you and your accountant found the rinse cycle." She told me that Vance Global Logistics was a ghost, a shell company that existed only to invoice the HOA, turning drug money into legitimate payments for landscaping and security, effectively using our monthly dues to sanitize cartel profits. "We need to move now," O'Malley said, tapping the table. "We were building a case, but if Tyler is talking, Gordon and Patty are going to spook. They'll liquidate the accounts and run to a non-extradition country within the week." The plan was set for Sunday, the annual Founders' Day picnic, the biggest event of the year, a mandatory attendance gathering where Patty loved to hold court and show off her benevolence. The perfect trap because they would never expect the hammer to drop while they were handing out potato salad. But the days leading up to it were a nightmare of paranoia. I sat in my workshop, the smell of sawdust replaced by the metallic tang of fear, cleaning my tools, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, jumping at every shadow. Gordon came back early from his business trip, a Blacktown car dropping him off at 3 a.m., and Stanley texted me that the HOA bank accounts were showing massive wire transfer attempts. They were trying to cash out. On Saturday afternoon, 2 men I had never seen before, built like vending machines with earpieces, knocked on my door. They didn't introduce themselves. They just stood on my porch, blocking the sun. "Mr. Miller," the larger one said, his suit straining against his shoulders, "our client is willing to buy your house. Double market value. Cash. Closing today, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave the state immediately." "I'm not selling," I said, keeping my hand behind the door frame where I had a heavy wrench resting on a shelf. "And tell your client that Oakwood Reserve isn't for sale either." "Unfortunate," the man said, cracking his knuckles. "Accidents happen in older houses. Gas leaks, electrical fires. Be careful." They walked away, but they didn't leave the street, sitting in a black SUV down the block, watching, waiting, and I knew that if the feds didn't show up tomorrow, I wasn't going to make it to Monday. I spent that final night looking at a photo of Elena, telling her that I was either going to get justice for her bike and our home, or I was going to die trying. But I wasn't going to let these people win, not while I still had breath in my lungs. Sunday morning dawned with a heat that was oppressive even for Texas, the air thick and motionless as if the world was holding its breath. The annual Founders' Day picnic was in full swing by noon at the community park, a surreal scene of suburban normalcy. Kids were screaming on the swing sets. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce filled the air, and there, in the center of the pavilion, stood Patty Vance, wearing a white floral dress that cost more than my truck, smiling that predatory smile as she ladled punch. Gordon Vance was there too, looking sweaty and pale, constantly checking his phone, his eyes darting around the perimeter like a trapped animal, clearly waiting for a confirmation that their funds had cleared so they could vanish. I walked in with Stanley and Maria, the 3 of us moving like a phalanx through the crowd of neighbors who were happily eating burgers, completely unaware that their HOA fees had been funding a drug cartel. Patty spotted me, and her smile faltered for a microsecond before she recovered, grabbing the microphone to start her speech. "Welcome, everyone," she chirped, the feedback squealing. "It's so wonderful to see our community coming together, despite the disruptive elements trying to undermine our values." She cast a pointed glare at me, and a few sycophants giggled. "Actually, Patty," Stanley's voice rang out, surprisingly loud as he stepped up, ignoring social protocol. "We need to talk about the budget." "This is not the time, Stanley," she hissed, trying to body block him. But Maria had already plugged a laptop into the AV system, and suddenly, the projector screen behind Patty, meant for a slideshow of neighborhood memories, lit up with bank records. Red arrows, highlighted transfers, shell companies. The crowd went silent. The only sound the sizzling of burgers on the grill. "What is this?" someone shouted. "This," I said, stepping forward, my voice steady, "is proof that Patty and Gordon have stolen over $4 million from us to launder money for a Laredo drug syndicate." "Lies," Patty shrieked, her face turning a mottled shade of purple. "He's crazy. He's senile. Call the police." "We did," I said calmly. And then, the park exploded. From the tree line, from the parking lot, from the disguised landscaping vans, FBI agents in tactical gear swarmed the pavilion, the bold yellow letters on their vests flashing in the sun. Gordon tried to run, bolting toward the parking lot, but Agent O'Malley tackled him near the bouncy castle, driving his face into the grass with a satisfaction that looked personal. Patty stood frozen, her ladle dropping into the punch bowl with a splash as agents surrounded her. "Patricia Vance," O'Malley announced, dusting off her knees as she walked back. "Gordon Vance, you are under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics." "You can't do this," Patty screamed as the handcuffs clicked, the sound echoing across the silent park. "I am the president of this association. I demand to speak to the manager of the FBI." "The manager," an agent chuckled, spinning her around, "is a federal judge, lady." Lexi, realizing the party was over, tried to sneak away toward her car, but Deputy Higgins, who I realized was now in handcuffs in the back of a squad car himself, had clearly given her up because 2 officers intercepted her. "But I'm untouchable," she wailed, a chaotic mess of tears and mascara. "My mom runs this place." "Not anymore, kid," I muttered as they led her away. The aftermath was a blur of legal proceedings that lasted for months. The evidence Stanley and I gathered was bulletproof, anchored by Tyler's testimony, and the paper trail Gordon was too arrogant to hide. Gordon Vance got 20 years in federal prison, his pharmaceutical empire exposed as a cheap front for misery. Patty, stripped of her power and her audience, crumbled in court, receiving 12 years for her role in the conspiracy. I heard she tried to organize an HOA in the cell block and got beaten up for it within a week. Lexi got a plea deal for 3 years, a harsh lesson that the real world doesn't care about your mother's title. As for Oakwood Reserve, the change was palpable. Stanley was elected the new treasurer, obviously, and he recovered nearly half the stolen funds through asset forfeiture, which meant Patty's fancy SUV and their house were sold to pay back the neighbors she terrorized. 6 months later, I was in my garage, putting the final coat of polish on the Honda CT70, which the FBI had returned to me as evidence once the case closed. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the driveway, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet. Not the heavy, oppressive silence of fear, but the peaceful, rhythmic silence of a community at rest. I sat on the bike, gripping the handlebars, and looked up at the sky. "We got him, Elena," I whispered. "We got him all. It's a happy ending, I suppose. The bad guys are in jail, the money was returned, and the garden Maria planted on the empty lot where the Vance house used to stand is blooming. But sometimes, late at night, I sit on my porch and wonder about the cost of it all. We rely on the law to protect us, to keep the chaos at bay, but the law only worked because I broke the rules, because I investigated, because I refused to be civil. It makes you ask the hard question, doesn't it? If the system is designed to protect the people with the most money and the loudest voices, is true justice something you're given, or is it something you have to take for yourself, no matter who gets hurt along the way? Tell me what you think in the comments. Was I a hero for taking them down, or just another vigilante who got lucky?